Hello and welcome at Book Lovers Companion. My name is Edith, and again the chattering teacup is away on tea things, tea business, tea events. Our CEO is enjoying a horizontal life pause, but here with me is author Christopher Gould. Hello Christopher, and welcome at Book Lovers Companion.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Thanks for being here. We are here to talk about your book, The Boys and Girls of America, which came out in April 2023. Before I hit the record button, we said Generation X is part or the integral part of this book. It's about this generation in particular. What can you tell our listeners about your book?
Well, it centers around it being a 1990s era college novel, and my protagonist is a visiting writer in residence. His name is James at this particular college. As luck would have it, it was his dream school many years ago, but unfortunately he didn't get in. So the premise is that he has a chance in the early 90s to go back and experience all that he thinks he missed out on. So he arrives on campus, and again, he's written one hit book. Unfortunately, the book in question, it's called Wit's End. It contains a lot of deep, dark family secrets that James would never want to come to light. And as he settles in on this college campus, a mysterious stranger starts to deliver these anonymous packages that threaten to expose the real hidden secrets of his life, and it becomes a increasingly alarming situation for him.
And his past is catching up with him, so to speak. Would that be correct to put it that way?
Indeed.
And I got the impression that is it possible that he put too much emphasis on being afraid of what might come out? Would it have been really that horrible, strange for him, being found out that a lot what's in his book is part of his own personal story?
I think you're onto something there. I think when things eventually do come to light, it's not quite as bad as he envisioned it being. I think he saw it as a way that could possibly end his career as a writer, and certainly the people in his life might not want to be around him any longer, but none of that proved to be true.
And would you say that he is a typical representation of this generation?
In a lot of ways, yes. Certainly he's very much a part of the pop culture scene. He's very much into many of the musical and film references that are in the novel that play just a huge part in the story. His particular writing style is not a Gen X kind of writing. However, it tends to be a bit of a atavistic throwback as the reader learns more about his past over the course of the novel. So in that respect, no, but in other areas, certainly.
You just said his writing style isn't at all typical for this generation, and he also mentions it's more a style of the 40s and the 50s because these are the books he consumed, as he is a ferocious reader himself. What is it about the writers of the 40s or 50s, especially for James, do you think, that draws him in so much?
I think he was very much influenced by his father, who, if you read the book, you learn that his father was this sort of book peddler, if you will. He owned a bookshop at one point. And in many cases, the books that James is most drawn to, the authors James is most drawn to, are in many cases the heroes of James's father himself. So there's a lot of influence in that regard.
But not also for him. Also, we learn about his relationships with his uncle or he calls him an uncle, his stepbrother.
Yes.
And the girlfriend, who's also a very diligent and ferocious reader. And they have a common ground. Books are their common ground, unlike with his stepbrother. And what I found interesting is this conversation they had about the book by Nabokov, where they say the way he writes, it makes you root for what we would call nowadays the villain. And yet when his writing is so good that you want the character to succeed.
That's very much the case with that particular work. And I've certainly had those kinds of conversations with my own friends who are heavily into the literature angle of things.
Mm. What do you think? I mean, since I said I'm also someone from the Generation X, I always wonder when the teacup and I talk about that, or when we talk with friends. You mentioned it before, the pop culture of this era. It was different than it is now. And thinking back with nostalgia on my end, maybe also on your end, can't speak for you, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. When I think back, for example, music, TV shows, I feel as if we did, or the people who represent this time did a lot of things right.
Agreed, no doubt.
There is something special. I mean, come to think especially about music. Speaking of, let's say, I don't know, the visuals are maybe not that good. Thinking of videos for certain pop songs, but the music itself, it was catchy. And also what they did, for example, you said it yourself, and it's also in the book, films and TV shows. Do you think that also for James and the friends he finds on college after he couldn't experience it himself the first time, that at the time it was a more positive outlook on things compared to now?
Yeah, I think it probably was. I mean, the early 90s, there are a lot of things going on politically in the world. We were coming out of a recession, really, at least here in the United States. But I mean, I certainly was very much a part of this generation. I went to college during the 90s. And although my experience isn't exactly the same as James, there is some carryover. And I remember many conversations, with my friends and, in the dorm rooms, and just some of the experiences I had. But I do think it was relatively positive for Gen Xers. I think people sometimes look at some of the stereotypes of Gen Xers as being slackers or maybe lazy, or those types of things. And that's characterized in a lot of popular films over the years. The movie Reality Bites comes to light, for example, which isn't a bad movie, but it does take some of those Gen X stereotypes maybe a little too far. But certainly the people that I hung around with had a pretty positive outlook in terms of their own futures and the particular goals that we wanted to achieve after we graduated and that kind of thing.
Absolutely agree. And now that you mention it, what we saw or what we experienced was a lot more positive. And also the way it was depicted in, let's say, sci-fi, because only today I read on the internet that Gene Roddenberry's wife would have her birthday today, which brought me back to all these positive things and this positive outlook in shows like Star Trek and so on. This utopian idea of a better future, which has turned completely around. And coming back to your book, James is also, I got the impression that James is also someone who has a more positive outlook. I mean, he's afraid of all the things that might come out, but deep down, he does have this hope that the future might bring better things.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree with you there. And obviously, there's a lot of things that transpire over the course of the novel. I don't want to reveal too much, but certainly there's one particular thing that happens that is very much a surprise to him. That certainly is a game changer, and he obviously has to think about the future very differently prior to having received that news.
Not just for him, it was also a big surprise for the reader as well, I have to say.
I hope so. I
Yeah.
hope so. I tried to do a good job of that.
Oh, yes, you did. You absolutely did. I was blown away. I thought, oh yeah, okay, goodness me. But in a positive way. And how it turned out in the end for him, it was also a positive way. He comes to term with it, and he comes to term with the past and what happened in the past. And there's a lot he put on his shoulders, although I would say it's not for him to put on his shoulders. Because, I mean, he wasn't the only one responsible, although he thinks he was the only one responsible for what transpired in the past. But as a reader, I thought, yeah, could he have really changed the outcome that much as he thinks he could have? I doubt it.
Yeah, that's true. He certainly carries a lot of regret, and towards the end, he is finally able to get past that, of course, which is part of his character arc. But yeah, prior to that, it just hangs over him, and despite his best efforts, it keeps coming up again and again.
And it's also in your book, it's also about not just being a member of Generation X, but also about being an author, what it means being an author, where you find your ideas, especially when he does this Q&As. And it's the typical questions, I suppose. Where do you find your ideas? What inspires you? How do you decide what to put in a novel, what not put in a novel? So the question is, for James as a character, where does he come from? Where did you find him, Christopher?
I think I've always wanted to write a novel about the college experience. And I have a very romantic view of that era of my life. It was a profound time in my own life, and I've always wanted to write about that. And I think I had the title in my head, Boys and Girls of America, many years, even back when I was writing my first novel. And I wasn't sure I'd ever get around to it. But he evolved on the page, very much so. I tend to write with a lot of spontaneity. And obviously, as you go through your various drafts, you make edits and you make alterations. But you eventually start to learn about your protagonist and who he is in his past. And then you can sort of build that character from there. So early on, I didn't know who he was. I mean, the novel opens up with this sort of picturesque view of all these students moving in, all these freshmen, if you will, moving into this college campus, and there's high expectations, and you have lots of parents who are very proud of their children, but at the same time, there's a lot of nerves, and there's a lot of maybe even some regret. Is this the place for me? Did I choose the right school? That kind of thing. And James, as the reader learns, he's sort of watching this happen. He's up in a window. He's looking down on this scene. And again, because he is at the dream school of his that he never got into, he sort of watches this with a certain amount of awe, if you will. And of course, he befriends many of these students eventually over the course of his time there. Sometimes for good reasons, sometimes for bad. But overall, I think he has a good experience.
I would agree. And the professor who more or less started this program, which makes it possible for him to be a writer in residence at the college. He's also a very fascinating and interesting character. And the way he opens up for James when he showed him this space where he keeps all the treasures, so to speak, the college owns. And I absolutely agree with James. I would be awed as well. So this wonderful place, it's sitting there and it's just used for storage. You have this and you don't do anything with it. It's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm something of a book collector. I enjoy getting old, dusty copies of books. I probably have more old books than I have space for, to be honest with you. So I'm very attracted with literary history and author memorabilia and that kind of stuff. So I wanted to include that in the book. And that, of course, also connects James and this particular professor together, not to mention James's own past with his father and his father's love of those kinds of things as well. So that's kind of a bonding moment to that. So I also like the idea of trying to celebrate authors more. I think we hear about movie stars and maybe musicians. They tend to get a little more attention, but I very much like the idea of authors being celebrated.
Yep.
So I wanted to include that kind of thing in the work as well.
Absolutely agree, because coming to think of movie stars, when you have an adaptation of a book, I mean, the original creator, the original mind behind this whole story was the author in the beginning. So why shouldn't he or she get the credit for it? I absolutely agree. And given the fact, like you said, that actors, actresses get all the attention, all the glory, yeah, maybe too much most of the time. Maybe too much. Absolutely agree. And being an author and having all those goodies there, I mean, being like a child in a candy store, I suppose. And like you said, collecting books. And the question, does one have too many books, or can one have too many books?
I think, I went through a pretty heavy book collecting stage, and it does become a storage problem after a while. And in many cases, I have duplicates of certain books, and in some cases, 3 or 4 copies of books that I love. But whenever I see them, I always want to grab them up for whatever reason. But yeah, I think in this particular time period, now you have books on tape, which a lot of people love. You have digital copies of the books, which is very convenient. I'm not really into that particular scene, but I certainly understand the advantages and can see why they're so convenient and readily available to people who might not otherwise want a hard copy of a book, for example.
And coming back to the characters in your book, we spoke about James. We spoke about a little bit, at least, about his or the professor who initiated the program. What about those other people who became during the book his friends? Are they people you yourself knew? Or are they just a collection of people you yourself knew? Or are they just complete fabrication? Or which I mean is, are they completely invented?
It's really a combination. I did try to avoid including any actual people that I was friends with or knew, but certainly there's certain characteristics that I draw upon from my past that I made into characters. So I guess I wanted to surround James with a variety of people. So you've got certain characters who are athletic, and others who are sort of more academic types. And in one case, there's one individual who's somebody he's not a criminal per se, but he's certainly does some underhanded things
Mm.
that brings a different element to the group of friends that they hang out with.
Mm.
So just a variety of different characteristics I wanted to surround James with. And of course, there's a love interest on campus as well
Mhm.
that develops too. So um, I think I had to sort of be measured in terms of not having too many characters
Mhm.
within his little circle because I think if I'd done more, it really would have made uh, maybe a little too overwhelming for the reader.
Mm. Would you agree that college life in the United States is a complete cosmos of its own? Because it's nothing like it is here in Austria, for example.
Yeah, I think it probably is very different. My own daughter just went off to college in Boston
Mhm.
this past year. She's a freshman. So I had very uh I had such a good experience. It was very important to me
Mhm.
that she find her own positive experience as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely think that's part of the whole situation for sure.
Mhm. And you already mentioned a little bit about that, but it's also in your book, and I would like you to elaborate on that because I usually ask our guests what would be their advice, and it's also a question James gets asked. What would be his advice? Would be your advice for any other aspiring author? And maybe you have the same advice as he does, or maybe it is your advice, just coming from him. Reading, reading.
Most definitely. I think when I wrote that section, um, I did spend a lot of time thinking about what James's response would be, and I would say that the advice James offers is probably the same advice I would offer.
Mm,
Is I don't think a lot of aspiring writers spend enough time reading
mm,
for sure. I think that's um, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's
mhm,
the classics, whether it's romance. But I think you really have to just overwhelm yourself with literature, and that's part of how you learn your own style of writing, your own process. Um, I am not classically trained. I don't have
mhm,
my MFA in creative writing. I took a different approach. So, and there's good and bad to those kinds of programs.
mhm,
But mine was very much a trial and error process. So, I mean, I started writing short stories many years ago. I had some short stories accepted for publication, which was really what spurred me on. And then I eventually got around to trying to write some novels, and it I was fortunate, but they both were accepted for publication.
mm. It's interesting that you mentioned that short stories because a lot of guests on our show mentioned that they first started writing short stories before they started their first novel. Comparing those two, which probably isn't comparable at all, but what would you say is the biggest challenge when you write a short story compared to writing a novel?
I think because I started with short stories, and I was again I was doing it all on my own. That was very challenging work for me. I remember there was one short story I actually spent an entire year working on it, and I still couldn't get it right.
Hmm.
So it was a very frustrating process
Mhm.
to say the least. And then I eventually sent out some work to be professionally critiqued, and I got some positive feedback, and that really turned things around for me. So, had I gone through an MFA program, I
Mhm.
probably would have been further along. But I'm still very happy with where I am today, regardless of that.
Mhm. And during the writing process when you write, be it short stories or complete novels, what is it for you that is easier? Is it easier for you to write dialogue? Or is it easier for you to write description? Because given the fact that some of our guests have also experience in script writing, they often say, oh, dialogue, that's the easy part. Because coming from that profession or that experience, it turns out putting a dialogue in a novel is not a problem at all.
I think I'm probably more best suited in terms of being a strong descriptive writer. I think my dialogue has gotten better over the years. Certainly, in the case of the Boys and the Girls of America, because there's so many characters, I did try to vary the dialogue as much as I could. I have somewhere I have some charts with all the characters listed and key phrases that those particular characters tended to use throughout the novel. But I think descriptive writing is probably my strong suit. I very much wanted to paint this very poetic version of college life, and I think that opening chapter, I was really striving for creating this romantic view of the college experience filled with a lot of detail, a lot of 1990s era detail, if you will.
Now that you mentioned it, what about research? Because sometimes, like we said, we have this certain nostalgia about this time which we enjoyed, and we might ask us, did I remember that correctly? Did you have to do a little bit of research making sure you did remember correctly?
Yeah, again, because there's a lot of pop culture references, there's specific rock albums that the kids and rock songs that the kids are listening to. Certain movies, for example, come up in the novel. So I did have to do some Google research in terms of making sure I had the time elements right and that kind of thing. So I did have to be careful about that. So yeah, I wanted to be as accurate as possible, of course.
Well, I can understand it. Otherwise, you might get letters saying, "Oh, dear sir, not at all. It did not happen like that."
Yeah,
or
right,
whatever.
right.
How can you?
Yeah.
I've read somewhere. Maybe you can say if I'm right or wrong, since your daughter is at the college as a freshman. I read somewhere that the younger generation is reading more printed books than ever. So there is a change that went on from all those, Kindles and so on to the printed book. We are coming back to the printed book. Is that correct? Is it exaggerated? What is your take on that?
I think my daughter's upbringing, she's always been surrounded by heavy readers. My wife certainly is a heavy reader. I'm a heavy reader. We don't read the same things, but we're mostly very much into physical copies of books. So my daughter, we just visited her a couple weekends ago, and she requested some of the books that she had in her room that we brought along to her. So yeah, she hasn't quite embraced digital ebooks, if you will. She's still largely a physical book reader for the most part. So, but yeah, I think it's certainly very different for her generation than mine. But I tried to instill the physical copy, as much as I could in her, for sure. But at the same time, it might be inevitable just because of how prevalent and certainly the convenience involved of ebooks. So,
yeah,
I also think it.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say I also think it depends on the kinds of books that you're reading. I tend to read a lot of more literary type of books, big name authors, well, whether it's Salinger, Capote, etc. So I like to collect those kinds of books, hardcover if I can.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something more modern, I don't necessarily read a lot of modern or contemporary fiction, but when I do, it doesn't really matter that much to me whether I keep that book or whether I store it in a special spot the way I would some of the more established writers that I love. So that's part of it too.
Do you also make a distinction between fiction or nonfiction? Because I prefer, let's say, the physical book, the printed book of a nonfiction over having it on a tablet or a Kindle. Can't see why, really, but I do.
Yeah, I've only recently gotten into nonfiction. I So I can't really say, but I do tend to stick to physical books regardless. There might have been the occasional book that I happened to see advertised online, and I might be like, I think I want to start reading this right now, and then I would just go on my iPod or my tablet or whatever, and just buy it so I can instantaneously read it. But for the most part, I don't do that.
There is also the question of more modern ways of writing, AI. How would someone like James, do you think, cope with the challenges? And how should we, as real people, cope with the challenge? What is your take?
Yeah, I certainly, I'm very much against the AI aspect when it comes to the creation of fiction. I know in the business world, if you're trying to come up with something that you want to send out to a client, there are some advantages to using AI for that. But when it comes to the creative arts, fiction, I would have to draw the line there for sure. I do know I have read articles that for example, a lot of self-published writers who use Amazon. Amazon has put a limit on how many books an author can submit during a particular time period, and that's mainly because some of these people are just doing these AI developed books one right after the other, and it's sort of bogging down the Amazon system, if you will. So I think we have to be very careful about that.
Well, on the other hand, thinking of books like 50 Shades of Boredom, they should have used AI, but it wasn't available at that time. But maybe the book might benefit from that, as far as I've heard. But what do I know? Who knows? You mentioned you don't have a MFA in writing, but what about the importance of a writing community for you personally?
Yeah, I live in just outside Syracuse, New York. So I have early in my writing career, I was a part of several writers' workshops that were available, and they were extremely helpful. I certainly benefited from working with some of the instructors in terms of the development of my own writing skills. But you do have to be careful when you share something, because you're going to get positive feedback and negative, and you have to sort of filter what can be usable and to you as a writer, and what can get you off track at the same time, because not all feedback is necessarily beneficial, whether it's positive or negative. You have to really filter that properly.
Interesting that you said it. And what about I don't know, being able to work together? Because there is, as far as I've learned in the writing field, there's not a lot, if at all, backstabbing between authors. It's more of a support system. Have you experienced that as well?
Yeah, I think I've I've had a largely good experience. I haven't really had any negative. Um, it's really helpful when I've sent work out to be
Mm-hmm.
professionally critiqued because you do hear um, a lot of eye-opening things
Mm-hmm.
that haven't necessarily occurred to you. And when you do send work out to various places for critique,
Mm-hmm.
um, for me that's probably the best advice because they don't really know me at all.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sitting looking over their shoulder as they are looking over my work.
Mm-hmm.
It's about as objective as you can get. So I tend to take that kind of advice probably the most seriously, and it's been very helpful. I picked up a ton of great things that I
Mm-hmm.
even carry over into my writing today because of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And now that you mentioned Amazon and self-published or independently published authors, mm, how, in your estimation, has the field of publishing changed? And what is your take? How will it change in the future now that we have to deal with said things as artificial intelligence?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I work with an independent press
Mm-hmm.
for both my novels. It's a Atmosphere Press out of
Mm-hmm.
Austin,
Yeah.
Texas. I've had a good experience with them on both occasions. So self-publishing is not going away for sure. It's probably
Mm-hmm.
going to continue to be a bigger part of the market. Um, but there's got to be a fine line in
Mm-hmm.
terms of what the readers want, in terms of how the traditional publishing world responds to that. Because I do think it can be sort of this uh, these two different groups sort of going
Yeah.
against each other. They have to sort of embrace each other at least to a certain extent.
Yeah.
And I think over time, probably you're going to see more of that.
Mm. Yeah, there's also quite a lot of traditionally published authors who also publish independently for various reasons, of course. I find it most interesting. And what about authors that say, I write exclusively or mostly for the market, writing for the market, not for myself, not for even the pleasure of it, maybe, but I keep a close eye on the market, what people want, and then I write.
That's a really good question. I'm not one of those people that can do that, unfortunately. um, yeah, I tend to have a set idea
Mm-hmm.
that I want to work on and go from there. I can't just look at the market and be like, oh well, there's a lot of dystopian literature. Maybe I'll try my hand at
Mm-hmm.
that. I could
Mm-hmm.
never do that. Um, but I do think even more established writers have done that, at least to get in their foot in the door. One of my favorite authors, he's certainly mentioned in The Boys and Girls of America,
Mm-hmm.
is J.D. Salinger.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at his early short story work,
Mm-hmm.
before The Catcher in the Rye came out or anything like that, it was during the 40s, of course, and he was writing a lot of short stories that dealt with military soldiers,
Mm-hmm.
and that was certainly a hot button topic
Mm-hmm.
uh, during that time period. So he was smart enough and clever enough to um, study the market and say, hey, geez, maybe I can get this published if I deal with this particular topic.
Mm-hmm.
So, and he did in many cases to get his foot in the door. So, for me, I can't do that.
Mm-hmm.
I have to write what's inside and go from there.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely understandable. Uh, do you think, or are you afraid that as an independent author, you might get pigeonholed? Or do you think it's the other way around as an established author? Is it easier for them? Maybe that's the reason why they go independent occasionally. So they can try out other things, other genres?
I think it is possible to be pigeonholed. I think, again, I've only published 2 novels. My first novel was definitely more of a literary fiction type of work. And Boys and Girls is probably more of a commercial novel. So, but that was a gradual progression. I think I had to base the particular style on the topic that I was choosing to write about. So, with Boys and Girls, because you're dealing with Gen X and you're dealing with 1990s era pop culture, it made sense for the style of the writing to be more contemporary, as opposed to literary. But I like both of those particular styles very much. So, but I wouldn't be worried too much about being pigeonholed. I guess if I was writing all sci-fi, for example, or if I was writing all romance novels, that might be a concern. But in my particular case, no, it's not something I really worry about too much.
And is there anything you would like to try, any particular genre, just for the fun of it? Not just saying you wouldn't dare, just give it a try because it sounds like fun.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'm pretty rooted in my projects. So I can't imagine ever branching out beyond literary or contemporary fiction. I would never want to write a sci-fi novel or anything like that, or like a romance novel. That would never do it for me, I don't think. So I think I'm pretty headstrong in that regard. So and I think it's because the particular books I like to read tend to be literary fiction with maybe a touch of contemporary as well. But beyond that, those are the kinds of works I like to work in for the most. So.
Yeah, understandable. I had this conversation with a colleague of mine, and she said, yeah, I always read fantasy and so on, and every time I'm disappointed with the ending, I would have done it this way or that way. And I said, yeah, well, give it a try. Why don't you sit down and give it a try? What's the worst that could happen? Is it possible to just sit down then and write your own version of events, so to speak? Or do you need more this compelling voice in your head to get down and write this novel?
I think for me, I definitely have to go back to what's in my head primarily. And a lot of what I do is very instinctive. I've been writing for, well over for 20 years now. And again, it's largely been a trial and error method for me, but I feel pretty good about how I go about writing. I know what particular strategies work as I'm sitting at the keyboard pecking away. I know when to take a break. I know when I need to get up and maybe grab a snack, maybe listen to some music before I get back on track. So I have a pretty good handle on that part of my process, at least for the most part.
Yeah.
That wasn't always the case. In the early going, it was very much a struggle.
Okay, yeah. You had to find your way. What works best for you?
Most definitely.
Yeah. Is time management or a certain kind of time management important for you or for authors in general, do you think?
I think definitely, especially if you are working in a particular career outside of writing fiction. I happen to be a teacher, so I have to be very disciplined with my writing time. So I like to write in the mornings primarily, sometimes in the evenings, but I tend to be an early riser, so I try to take advantage of that as much as possible. But you definitely need to be disciplined with it, and you also have to know when to take a break from it. So after I finished Boys and Girls, I probably took almost 2 months off, and now I'm back in the process of writing my my first draft of my next book, which is not very far along, but I'm not in any rush.
You said you took a break of 2 months. What about the editing process? Because is it beneficial, would you say, also to let a finished manuscript sit for a while before you come back to it and do the editing or start the editing process?
Yeah, no doubt. That is a big part of it. Is it certainly needs time to breathe, and you need to be able to look at it with a fresh set of eyes, if you will. So, I tend not to let anyone look at my early drafts until they're pretty far along. So I like to really have a pretty polished version before I let an editor look at it. Some writers are different. Some writers have maybe a friend that they might share something with just to get some feedback. I'm not one of those people. That's not part of my process, really.
And speaking of editors, there's always the question, how much influence does the editor have, or how much influence do you grant the editor? Because as an independent author, it's all up to you.
Yeah, Atmosphere Press, they're pretty author friendly, and you obviously work with a variety of editors, whether it's a line editor or whoever, as you go through that editing process. And sometimes there are things that are obvious goofs I've made that I'm very happy that they caught. And sometimes it's very subjective kinds of things. And sometimes we agree, sometimes we don't, but it generally works out for the best.
And Christopher, you touched a little bit upon that, but you might be able to elaborate on it. What are the plans for the future? What can your fans, your readers expect?
Well, like I said, I'm in the process of a first draft of my third novel. It's many years off. I think there was probably 4 years between my first book and Boys and Girls. So I would expect a similar timeline in terms of that process. So Boys and Girls is a pretty lengthy novel. But this next one certainly won't be of that length for sure. It's just by the nature of the story.
Okay. So your fans have to wait a little bit.
Yeah. I like to keep them in, waiting, if you will.
Okay. Christopher, is there anything else you would like our listeners to know?
No, I think if people in your audience are interested in becoming a writer, I think they should dedicate the time to do it. If you feel it inside you, if you have this burning sensation to write like I did, then I think you have to go for it.
And is there any particular message for Generation X from your side?
I think you need to support one another and make sure that we're not forgotten, which is one of my fears.
Oh, I don't think so. Oh, I don't hope so that we will be forgotten. No, I don't think so. Well, I hope so. Oh, goodness me. No. That won't do. Christopher, thank you very much for joining me. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.
You did enjoy this episode as much as we did? Then hit subscribe and don't miss the next episode. Also, make sure to follow us on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram. If you like to support us and buy us a coffee, you can do so via Buy Me a Coffee and other platforms. You can find all the necessary links in the description. Until next time.